All right. It is 3:30, so in the interest of respecting everyone's time, we're going to get things going here. Hello to everyone out there in Zoom land, and welcome to our seminar, Translation of Science from Research to Application and Adaptation, hosted by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center Global Change Fellows. Your hosts today are myself and Caleb Goff. I, Thomas Thalen, will be kicking off our seminar with speaker introductions, and Caleb will take over to MC the Q&A. Working hard behind the scenes to support this seminar are our top-tier tech team of Gennaro Knowles, Darian and G, Miley Neal, and Titilayo Tajuddin. We're fortunate to be joined today by three panelists with a wealth of experience thinking about how to build bridges between experimental findings and tangible real-world impacts. First, we will hear 10-minute presentations from each of our three speakers, Dr. Timothy Glotfelty, Dr. Elizabeth Sciaudone, and Jeffrey Beane. Then the remainder of the hour will be dedicated to Q&A for you all to ask questions about how to translate scientific research to applications in the real world. As you think of the questions during the talk, please put them in the chat or write them down, and we will give you a chance to unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you would like, and ask your question. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Timothy Glotfelty. He's a research scholar at the NC State Climate Office, whose work focuses on global climate models and regional climate and policy initiatives. Feel free to share your screen and take it away, Dr. Glotfelty.
Right. Thank you, Thomas, for that introduction. So today I'm going to talk about an application of climate science I had with chilled blueberries that I like to call my North Carolina climate science adventure. So first, as a brief background about what climate science is. So climate science is the study of the long-term state and processes governing the Earth system. It spans a range of scales from the global to regional to local and the feedbacks between them. And it encompasses a wide range of disciplines, from meteorology to oceanography, chemistry, geography, and even social sciences. So since you're dealing with a long-term investigation, typically you're looking at two different modes of doing your science. Either you're looking into the past or you're looking into the future. So if you're looking into the past, you're looking over historical records, and you're analyzing observations or estimated observations. So you can come up with things like average monthly totals for rainfall for a location, or the average monthly temperature patterns. If you're looking into the future, here you're dealing with future projections, and these are typically multi-decadal storyline scenarios that are generated via climate models. And here what you're looking at is the change from some type of historical reference point into some future time period under your different scenarios of interest. So what are these climate modeling tools? So what a climate model does, at least the modern versions, is that they break the planet up into little boxes or cubes for different portions of the atmosphere, the land surface, the ocean, and even different parts of the ice. And so at each of these points, we can solve the governing equations of these different mediums on our supercomputers. And then they can represent various different processes. So for the atmosphere, you can generate clouds, thunderstorms. For the land surface, you're talking about how water runs through the soil, the different vegetation, formation, growth, and death. For ocean, you're getting waves, currents, things like that. And for ice, you can do the melting and freezing of snowpack and glaciers and such. So how do you apply these things to the real world? So the application that I found most interesting working at the State Climate Office was an application to blueberry farming. So before I came to the State Climate Office, I wasn't aware of this, but blueberries, like many other fruit and nut species of plant, require a certain number of what's called chill hours, or number of hours between freezing and 45 degrees Fahrenheit in order for them to maintain dormancy over the winter and produce flowers and fruit the next year. So our office was approached by some blueberry farmers in Bladen County at Blue River Legacy Farms. And the question that they wanted to know is, what types of blueberry varieties will they have to plant over the next 20 years to adapt to climate change? Because different species of blueberry have different chilling requirements. So we couldn't answer this question in its totality because we're climate scientists and not plant scientists at the State Climate Office. So the scientific question that we could answer for them is, how will climate change impact Bladen County's chill hours moving into the future? So the first challenge we come across in deciding what future projection data set to use. So this is a very localized impact, so it needs a very high spatial resolution data set. And one of those data sets that you can get is what's called the MACA data set. And what this does is it takes global climate model output that's very coarse and boxy, as you can see here, and they relate this output to observations to kind of pattern match it and change it from coarse resolution to finer resolution. And the pros of using this data set is that we have this data for 20 different climate models that are included in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. Its spatial resolution is about 10-kilometer grid box or 6-kilometer grid boxes. We have data for every day from 1950 to 2099. It includes multiple scenarios. So the two scenarios we looked at here are the RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. The values of 4.5 and 8.5 are kind of a very abstract thing to most people. What they represent is the amount of extra radiation that's maintained by the atmosphere under these scenarios. But if you want to think about them as something more tangible, the RCP 4.5 is a low greenhouse gas emission scenario where they implement emission controls. And the RCP 8.5 is a high greenhouse gas emission scenario where there's very few emission controls. But the issue we run into using this data set is that it only contains daily maximum minimum temperatures. So to try and get the number of hours that you're in that temperature range, we have to estimate that from the available data. So now that we knew what our future projection data is, the question is, what is the current climate situation at our blueberry farm? So we found that our blueberry farm here is located approximately 30 miles from two different weather observation stations managed by our State Climate Office, which we call the EcoNet. So we had to do two things. First, we had to calculate the number of chill hours using the hourly resolution data. So count the number of hours that you're in our temperature box window. So that would be the actual amount of chill hours. And then we also had to estimate the number using that same maximum minimum temperature method so that we could do an apple-to-apple comparison between the observation data and the future projection. So I did that for both these stations, and you can see for every year in our period of record, there's the daily value in this blue bar and the hourly value in the orange bar. And you can see there's a decent difference between these on any given year. So if we aggregate that out, we find that on average, the hourly method finds about 880-ish chill hours in a given season in this area, and the daily method comes in about 100 hours less per chill season. So you can tell it's not huge, but there's a decent difference between these two methods. So now that we know our current climate chill hours, we need to take a look at the trends from climate change. So the first challenge we run across here is that the years from a climate model aren't real. And so what this means is that here you have the values for the year 2006, but this isn't the actual year 2006 that happened. The model simulates the greenhouse gas levels that are representative of the year 2006. So it's 2006-ish without being actual 2006. So the way we try and simplify this to get useful information is that we create two different time slices, a current model average slice and a future model average slice. So our current portion is 2006 to 2025, which roughly corresponds to our observation period. And then our future climate average is 2026 to 2045, or the next 20 years. And we assume the impact of climate change in these projections is the difference between these two averages. And that's what's shown over here on the left for the low emissions RCP 4.5 scenario. So you can see here, because it's warming, we're losing chill hours across central into the eastern part of North Carolina, except up in the mountains, you're actually getting a little bit more. And this is because the warming is moving you out of freezing into our chill temperature window. So if we try and put this all together again, so here is the information from those two observation stations. To make this comparable, we averaged all the data in this little box that's Bladen County down here in southeast North Carolina. And as you notice here, these numbers are all a little different, which brings us to our compounding issues. So this daily estimation method underestimates the real amount of chill hours by about 100 hours, as I mentioned last slide. But if you look here, the climate model projection overestimates the chill hours using the same method by about 200 hours per chill season. And then if we look into the future, each of them is projecting roughly a decrease in 100 chill hours over the next 20 years from climate change. So then the answer is like, well, what is the real change here? And is that just the hourly amount, which is the real amount, minus the 100-hour change from the models? Maybe, maybe not, but at this point, this is kind of like the best you can do. So another question we had from our blueberry farmer is he wanted to look at what he called good chill, which in terms of real world applications means kind of like, is the chill consistent? Because you can have situations where you're in that chill window and then all of a sudden it heats up and it's really warm for a couple of weeks. So he wanted to know what years had this kind of good chill that was very consistent. And so we had to dig into the data to try and figure out what that means. And we're still trying to iron that out. But the rough answer we came with to get started was the years that have relatively decent chill hours, you usually get about 8 hours of chill per day during a given week. And so we calculated this for our observation station and then also for our models. And so what we found at the observations is that there's a big difference in whether you meet this criteria between our daily and hourly method. And so what this graph here is showing you is in the orange, this is the hourly method. So on January 6th, for instance, in all of our years, eight of those 14 years met that criteria. But if you use the daily method, it drops down to 1. And another thing that you'll notice here is that in the observations, very few weeks during the year have a lot of years that meet this criteria, which is telling you that the observations have a lot of year-to-year variability. So sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's not, and this varies from year to year. But if we look down here in the model, here what's shown here in yellow, this is the future. What's shown here in purple, this is the current. So you see that all of our 20 or so simulated years start to hit this criteria once you get into the core part of this chill season. And what this is telling you is that the climate models don't have a ton of year-to-year variability. It's very low. They're not capturing what the real world is doing. But the information they can give you is because it's getting warmer, you're not meeting this chill requirement till later and later into the season. And then over here on February on the reverse side, you're starting to lose it more. So the chill season is becoming compacted due to climate change. But this issue with model variability is one of the greatest challenges facing the climate modeling community because they can't represent things like El Niños, La Niñas, polar vortexes, and things like that very well. So if I was going to summarize the biggest challenges of adapting research with climate models to real-world applications, the first is that climate models are really reality-based fiction. So they're based on first principles, physics, chemistry, and the like, but everything they simulate, the numbers they generate, they're all technically wrong, which is in the business, that's why we say all models are wrong, but some models are useful because they'll give you useful information, but the numbers they generate aren't necessarily what's going to happen or what did happen. The second issue is what we can call the climate crystal ball. So this is you're looking out into your future projections, but what can they really tell you? They can give you a vague impression of what the future is going to be. So this is kind of the mean change. So I can tell you it's going to get warmer. And I can tell you the number of chill hours are going to decrease, but I can't tell you when that's going to be, what years are going to be the bad years, things like that, because the models can't reproduce that level of variability. And so overall, this causes technical challenges in trying to adapt research to real-world applications because a lot of the time stakeholder questions are very complex and the tools we have available just aren't up to matching what people are asking directly. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and pass it to the next speaker. But if you're interested in this work, our work with the Blueberry Farm was featured in this WUNC podcast, looking at different climate aspects that was published back on October 5th.
All right. Thanks so much for that great talk, Dr. Glotfelty. Lots of really interesting challenges to think about there. Just a reminder to audience members, remember to pop your questions in the chat as you think of them so Caleb can call on you in the Q&A that we'll be hosting after the last talk. And with that, next, I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Sciaudone. Dr. Sciaudone is a former research assistant professor in the NC State Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering and currently works at Moffatt Nichol as a coastal engineer. Dr. Sciaudone, feel free to share your screen and start your talk here.
Great, thanks, Thomas. I appreciate it. And thanks so much for that previous talk. That was really interesting, something totally different from the kind of stuff I work on. So just a quick outline. I'm just going to talk briefly about another case study. In my case, in civil engineering, I'm going to talk about coastal highways and coastal highway vulnerability. We have a long-term monitoring program with the NC Department of Transportation that's run through NC State, and one of my colleagues has now kind of taken the lead on that. She's Thomas's advisor, actually. And just going to talk through the research, the application, how that's been used in adaptation, and then also highlight a couple recent student projects that have been conducted. And one of those people who recently graduated was a former CASC fellow, so wanted to just touch on her work. So this photo you see here, you can clearly see it's a coastal highway. It's very vulnerable to sea level rise, current storms, and so forth. This project has been going on since the late 1980s, actually. NCDOT has known for a long time that this stretch of roadway that extends from an inlet all the way down to some towns on the Outer Banks, Avon, Buxton, Hatteras, that are pretty much connected to the mainland only by this road and a ferry system. So our department has been monitoring this roadway, and particularly the stretch that covers the National Wildlife Refuge at Pea Island, in order to identify the most vulnerable areas currently, and then also in the future with climate change, and to inform future phases of what's called the NC12 Transportation Management Plan, which is kind of NCDOT's long-term vision of how they are going to handle maintaining the transportation corridor on these barrier islands. There's also something that is called meet the requirements of the 2012 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service easement. There is a coastal structure at the north side of this wildlife refuge. It's a terminal groin. As part of the agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service to place this groin on what's a national seashore as well as a national wildlife refuge, NCDOT also has to meet some sort of permit conditions that specify that they'll be monitoring for any potential impacts of the groin and ongoing, and just inform ongoing management of the refuge and the transportation corridor. There have been a lot of different research projects that have been conducted kind of under auspices of this program. One of the first ones of these was a program to develop and evaluate different indicators of vulnerability for coastal roads. So, okay, we're monitoring this area. What are the most effective things to look at as far as to quantify the vulnerability? And one of the papers about that work is highlighted here, was published in Natural Hazards Review. And that's where we pulled together the primary vulnerability indicators that we're using in the program and how we're predicting future impacts. Those indicators are kind of these three primary ones: the width of the island, how high the dune crest is above the road, and what's called the critical buffer, which is just the distance from the shoreline to the road. This is a value kind of exact of 230 feet. This came out of some research that was done really a long time ago, before I even came to NC State, where a student went down to NC DOT, and what was previously done a lot in this stretch was the road would be moved landward when it was frequently impacted by overwash or damage from storms and so forth. So they quantified how often, how far away was the shoreline from the road when that happened. And historically, it was about 230 feet away, and that's where that number comes from. So again, this is a map of the area. This is in Dare County, out on the Outer Banks. The terminal groin is shown here, and this is the stretch of road that I'm going to focus on as far as the monitoring program. So every year we get data 4 times a year on the topography of the island. We get photos, aerial photos from NCDOT 6 times a year. We calculate all of those indicators that I just showed, as well as the erosion rates. We refine the erosion rates, and we take these erosion rates along with the uncertainty in the prediction and try to estimate what the island shape will look like in the future. And the predictions that we're doing right now are to 2030 and 2060. And when we started this program, 2030 seemed like a long time in the future, but it's getting really close now. We do report to NCDOT the vulnerability on an annual basis. Our primary indicators, this is I don't know how to get rid of this thing, but no, here we go. Our primary indicators, the island width, the dune crest, and the critical buffer that we're using. And then when the program started in detail 2010 and all the way through 2021, you can see how things changed. The island width hasn't really changed a whole lot. The dune crest changes a lot. But what's really interesting is the critical buffer, which really reflects how the shoreline has been changing, because that critical buffer is indicating that the shoreline's getting closer to the road. So you can see in this northern area, there's been an increase in the number of the stretch of roadway that's been vulnerable but due to erosion, in a couple other places as well. We also forecast the vulnerability in the future, and highlight those areas. And I want to draw your attention to this area right here. That has continuously been an issue. And when we predict the shoreline, that really comes in contact with the road very quickly. And this is the 2030 prediction. This is the 2060 prediction. And so while this is something that's actually being used by DOT, so they have actually constructed a bridge to bypass this area. It's now open. This bridge completely avoids that section of roadway that has been documented as the most vulnerable. So this is a very satisfying application of this research. Really has informed decision making on the state level, and some big changes. They've actually removed the roadway in this area that's bypassed by the bridge, and that land has been reverted back to the wildlife refuge. So some other, I don't want to go over my time. Some recent student research has included looking at other indicators instead of just those 3, looking at other different things, all kinds of different metrics of the potential vulnerability. And there's been 2 publications on that. And additionally, Sophia Rosenberg, who a lot of you may know, was a former student of mine who has actually taken a look at that area where the bridge was built, and focused in on this area, this section of roadway that's been removed, and did some numerical modeling. to determine what the future morphology could look like and what those implications are for management of the wildlife refuge. We often think about kind of overwash and damage to the road as negative things, but the wildlife refuge actually, the overwash fans produce really good habitat for piping plovers and other shorebirds. So that's something that they're really interested in seeing, kind of how that area evolves. And so Sophia did some numerical modeling on potential changes there as well. So those kind of are some things that I just wanted to highlight as far as my work and how that has been used in application. And that is all for me. Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Sciaudone. I know some of our global change fellows actually had a chance to drive over that bridge on a recent science retreat we had out this summer. So we've seen that adaptation in action firsthand. Our third and final speaker today is Jeffrey Beane. Mr. Beane is a herpetology collections manager at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, focused on research projects surrounding the conservation of reptiles and amphibians in the Carolina Bays. I'm excited for your talk. Mr. Beane, take it away.
Well, my talk is going to be quite different from the others. I'm not really sure what I'm doing here, so I'm just going to tell you what I do, what we do at the museum. I've been with the museum for 38 years, 4 months and 21 days or something like that, but who's counting? I should have retired a long time ago, but too busy to do that, too much to be done. Our mission statement, I don't know who comes up with these mission statements, but our current one is to eliminate the natural world and inspire its conservation. We had a previous one, which was a little more complicated, but basically said the same thing. The museum, of course, has a lot of different sections. I work with the research and collections section, and we document the natural history of North Carolina, and to a lesser extent, the southeastern U.S. and the world, by building and maintaining collections and the associated data. That's our primary activity. And when people look at our collections, they say, well, why do you need all these hundreds of jars of dead snakes and frogs? Well, it's not the jars and the specimens so much as the data that go with them are what is important. And natural history collections are like a library, except if a library burns down, you can replace the volumes of books. If we lost our collections, we would not be able to go back in time and replace those specimens. Some of those places are not there anymore. They're covered with roads and buildings and whatnot, and the species that were collected at that time don't exist there anymore. So we keep a record of past and present geographic distributions. Our collections are used for identifications, taxonomy, systematics, evolution, anatomy. We've even loaned specimens to artists and sculptors and wood carvers, things like that. Unlimited use potential for our collections. But what we do is basically, in my unit, the herpetology unit of research and collections, we gather basic natural history information on all the reptiles and amphibians in the state. Where they occur, how common or rare are they, how big do they get, what do they eat, how do they reproduce, how many eggs do they lay, how many young do they have, what eats them, what's their ecological role, what are their activity patterns. And we've been doing that for the 125 years or so since the museums existed. Now there are a lot of other people and agencies that are working toward the same goals, but we've probably been doing it longer than anyone else. And my job entails a lot of different things, but mostly I care for a large collection of curated specimens and spend huge amounts of time in the lab preparing specimens, taking tissues for genetic work. Our main purpose is to maintain these collections so that other people can do whatever research they're interested in. My job's supposed to be about 25% research, but it's really not not quite that much. I do most of my so-called research in my spare time, and it's very, very basic. I'm not working on any cutting edge, high-powered research projects. All the research we do is very, very basic here. I spend a lot of time reading and deleting emails and answering people's requests for information and things like that. But I do get to do some field work and of various types. Some of it's very general, and some of it is on specific kinds of projects. Like in 1995, I started a thing called Project Simus after Heterodon simus, the southern hognose snake, which was basically to gather any and all information on this species, which is a longleaf pine associate. The longleaf pine ecosystem is about 97% gone. So the 3% that's left, we're doing our best to try to gather information on the species that still live there. I sort of expanded this project to include the pine snake, the coach whip, and the chicken turtle. All these creatures are in the same boat. They all use sandy longleaf pine uplands in the longleaf pine ecosystem. And I do radio telemetry with these species. I've been radio tracking these 4 species for 25 years now, just trying to piece together their life histories and things like that. I also worked with Project Bog Turtle. I was one of the founding members of this project, which is a grassroots non-governmental initiative to with the ultimate goal of protecting the bog turtle and its habitat in North Carolina in the southeast. The bog turtle's found in the mountains and foothills. It's a very, very specialized animal. It uses open spring-fed wetlands, and there are very few of these kinds of habitats left. We cooperate with state and federal agencies and with private landowners to search for new sites, monitor known existing populations, and try to do habitat management. These are early successional sites, and if left alone, they turn into canopied wetlands that the turtles don't use anymore. So most of the best sites are on private land. So we do a lot of work with private landowners, try to protect the species. And I also do opportunistic monitoring of some of the rare and declining amphibian that breed in the ephemeral wetlands, such as Carolina bays. That's not really the focus of my research. It's just kind of something I do opportunistically. Carolina bays are elliptical depressions in the coastal plain with a northwest-southeast orientation. There've been loads of theories as to how they were formed, but today more people are interested in what's living in them and how we can protect the fragmented ones that are still left. So all these 5 species and many others use these sites and other ephemeral wetlands, and we just monitor these sites opportunistically to gather what data we can. I also try to keep track of all the introduced invasive reptile and amphibian species in the state, and we're getting quite a few. Some of these species are well established. Things like the red-eared slider and the Mississippi map turtle and Mediterranean gecko have been here for many years and are established in a lot of places. Others, like the Cuban tree frog and the Brahminy blind snake, the greenhouse frog, just show up once in a while. Some, like the brown anole, are here, but they're only associated with greenhouses, horticulture, places like that. And then we have ones like the Texas horn lizard that exists in a small population down the coast. It's been there for many years, but it's not particularly invasive. There are degrees of invasiveness. So we keep track of all those things and a lot more things. And now all this relates to application of research is that we work closely with a lot of other agencies. We work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and with other state agencies, the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, and with many groups such as the Nature Conservancy and the local land trusts that are in the business of trying to protect the habitats that we still have left for these species that are severely declining. And they use all the information that we gather to try to make decisions on how to keep these things going until something comes along and takes us out, because we're destroying this planet. And if all I can do is just document that destruction, that's what I'll continue to do. That's all I've got. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff, and definitely an important and sobering message. I know we have some ecologists here in the room, so thanks for everyone being here and contributing. Thanks to our presenters. So my name is Caleb Goff. I'm a PhD student here and part of the Global Change Fellows, and I'm going to be the host for the Q&A section. The way that this will work is we've been collecting some of the questions from the chat. And so we'll give those around. And if you have a burning question and you are well-versed in using your hand gestures, you can try to put your hand up. But we've got quite a few questions and not a ton of time here. And I'm sure there's some interesting discussion. If you want to have further discussion about these questions, go ahead and do that in the chat. I think that's fine if there's a kind of some side conversations happening there. And then if we don't get to your questions, sorry. Hopefully you'll feel excited and inspired to send the presenters an email after this and get that conversation going offline. So without further ado, us Global Change Fellow grad students are going to selfishly take the first question for ourselves. We have a big long list of questions and sort of ways of tying these themes back together that we're excited about. The major theme that we kind of built this seminar and these speakers around across these different disciplines is thinking about translating research and the applied. So we want to ask each seminar presenter, and we can just go in order. Maybe we'll just do Tim, Beth, and then Jeff again. And the question is, we're interested to hear you all share your perceptions about the other presentations. So what can we learn from each other across broad disciplines about the translation of science? Are there obvious differences? I'm sure there are, but let's try to focus on some of the obvious commonalities. Happy to repeat the question too, so it's a little jumbled. The question is, what are some commonalities that you heard from the other presenters about the translation and application of science? Like, is there any sort of common ground here, or are we just all in our own silos doing our own thing with our own challenges?
Well, I think there's a decent amount of overlap here, because I think with Beth's presentation, she talked about some of the challenges and looking, she looked at some modeling, to see how things will go. And then in Jeff's case, that he's more like the reverse of what I talked about in the past, documenting the change over time. So I think a lot of these things have commonalities. I think the exact thing that you're doing is very specialized, but I think everybody is either, looking to the past or looking to the future.
We all care about the future, and we're trying to get other people to care about it.
Yeah, and to tack onto that too, I think all of us actually had a commonality where we interact with stakeholders and try to tap into what needs are communicated to us from like a blueberry farmer or someone who is concerned about ecological impacts and our DOT impacts. I mean, it's all kind of tied to what are the needs that have been kind of articulated by stakeholders. That's something that I think is really important for all researchers who are trying to move their research into the applied sphere, is to listen to the stakeholders and get their input and like Jeff said, take advantage of kind of like tacking onto things that other people are interested in or facilitating their work as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, we'll go through some of the more specific questions. So we had a question from Sarah Edwards in the chat. This is for you, Tim. And the question was that this person is curious about the assumptions of the downscaling process. Their question is sort of culminating in what should we be wary about when it comes to downscaling. And I recognize downscaling might be a little jargony for some folks out there. So maybe you can say again what downscaling is, and then ask this question of what should people be wary about when they hear about downscaling or see downscaling.
So I will preface this by saying that I myself personally am not a statistical downscaling expert, in that I've never run the codes that do it. But essentially what downscaling does is that's the process where you have to take the very coarse resolution data that you get from the global climate model and translate it onto something more fine scale. So that's how you get like that 6 kilometer version. And so There is probably some smoothing, but essentially what they do is they do like a pattern matching thing, which would actually be made easier probably moving into the forward with machine learning or AI, where they look at the patterns that they see and then match it to an observed pattern that they see in the finer version. And that's what they call like the analogs in this method. And so they try and match those, and so then they can map the values from the coarse resolution data set into the fine one. But I think the biggest issue that I would say the biggest issue that happens here is that if that analog is wrong, so say like there was high precipitation or the model shows high precipitation out in eastern North Carolina, but what the mapping method maps that onto a tropical storm, then you're going to end up with like a huge rainfall estimate that isn't really there. So there can be, since it's all statistics, things can get screwed up. There can be uncertainties and things like that. So that's why statistical downscaling is its own type of fiction too. So you have to be worried about the numbers you're getting and how high or low they are and whether they're realistic or not.
Awesome. And feel free to, Sarah, feel free to follow up in the chat if I've misconstrued your question. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, next question is for Beth. It's a question that came from Graham, and the question is about the process for choosing or arriving at vulnerability models that are digestible for Department of Transportation employees. And so just reading the question here, the process to arrive at a model that could quickly, oh, sorry, I just said that. Yeah. What's the process to arrive at a model that's digestible for a Department of Transportation employee?
That's a great question. We actually have been having for years meetings twice a year with a stakeholder group that includes DOT, Fish and Wildlife, other researchers at the Coastal Studies Institute, and sort of getting their feedback and as the model and the vulnerability indicators are developed, I think was really important. We tried to, we tried to do something that would capture kind of like the most important processes, being long-term erosion with the shoreline position, storm impacts with the dune, and then breaching, like where the whole island completely gets cut in between with the island width. So yeah, I thank you for saying that you think it's easily digestible. Yeah, it was definitely an iterative process, keeping contact with the stakeholders and partners to make sure that we're capturing something that's useful to them.
Awesome. And then a question for Jeff that's popped up here is about this sort of continuum between natural historians, between researchers, and then between like the things that research produces. And then I guess there's maybe one more train in that car, which is then like the things that get done with that information. And you kind of described yourself as being like near the back end of that train car. Is that kind of how you see that, like as a continuum? And then inside of that continuum, if you will, maybe what are some ways that kind of conversation across those train cars could happen, from naturalists to researchers to the research that they actually present to the world to the things that get done?
Well, there's always a need for more communication between those kinds of people, but there is some, and there's a lot of amateur naturalists out there, obviously birders and things like that. And there's a huge amount of citizen science going on these days, and a lot of people are incorporating that into research. Just an example, the Christmas bird count's been going on for well over a century, and people who have used more rigorous statistical methods to survey bird populations have found that the data gathered over the Christmas bird count is at least as accurate as the other data that they were using, just because of the huge volume of it. But there's a lot of frustration among people who want there to be more done to protect the world in general. There's so many people who just don't seem to care, who, they think, well, scientists are going to take care of all of our problems. And everybody's got to start working to take care of our problems, not just scientists and researchers.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think in ecology and in biology, we sort of know, like, we have these naturalists and there's just all this information that's there with those people that isn't like super easy. Like, it's not like on Google Scholar, you can't just like jump in and like take that. And there are just like people who hold on to that information. And I wonder if there's a kind of surrogate for that idea in other fields that are related to climate change, or like solving some of the problems of the climate crisis. And I think that, Beth, maybe you just described one of those, which is like how you go through this iterative process with DOT employees. Maybe there's other examples that we can think of. Feel free to say if there are, otherwise I'll move on to the next question. Okay, another general question that was just recently in the chat, again from Graham, and I'll just let anyone take this one who's interested in it. Do you ever find that there are important facets you want to research that no one's funding, or not enough funding to make it feasible to move into? And in this case, what do you do? Do you just sort of move on, or yeah, how does funding affect the whole picture?
Jeff, you just said you're doing it all on the side.
Yep. People who love what they do, if they don't have money to do it, they just do it in their free time. I do things on my vacation that are the same things I do at work. We just do what we can. That's all we can do. I'd love to have funding.
I have a bit of a follow-up to that. Us graduate students are a little bit new to the research scene, but you all have been around a little bit longer. Have you seen a bit of a shift from in more funds being directed to applied research, or does that kind of seem like that's stayed the same over the past decades?
I'll take that one. Yeah, so, well, at least I'll give you my perspective. I do think that, there are sources for very applied research. Some of the things like a DOT, they definitely have their own research priorities. So if your research interests align with their priorities, they're a good source of funding for applied research, because it is usually very hands-on. I mean, there's research funded by DOT on how many those blue signs at every exit, like how many of those can be on one sign, and so they do some very applied research funding. But I would say that I think recently in the climate sphere, I have seen more applied research funding available from places like NOAA, for resilience and adaptation kinds of things. Again, I'm coming at this from the engineering sphere. As far as the naturalist sphere, I actually, because I'm not in that area, I don't know really. I think it's pretty neat that there's the opportunity for farmers to just contact the state climate office and ask a question like that. Like, I don't even know how they heard that they could do that. I'm impressed that they knew that they could ask those kinds of questions. So good job communicating on your capabilities at the climate office. I think the more people who are concerned, like Jeff said, about different effects and impacts on the environment communicate that to your legislature, your legislators, both state and federal, and give guidance that you want to see that kind of stuff funded. I think that is one way for individuals to impact kind of that area, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's super well said. Other burning questions? I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Other burning questions from our audience? Otherwise, I know we have a few others stacked up here. You want to jump in? Okay. Another question, a question from Darian, which is, how important is the process of managing stakeholder expectations throughout a project? And is this something that you ensure happens before a project begins, or does it kind of get pushed back? And one example, which I think is thinking about your presentation, Tim, is about model uncertainty. So just to restate the first half of the question, how important is the process of managing stakeholder expectations throughout a project?
I personally think it's very important. Usually anytime somebody asks a climate model related question, I start out the gate with all the caveats about what I'm going to tell you, because, you know, it pretty much should come with a disclaimer about what's going on. But I try and make sure that they understand what the strength, like what I can actually tell them versus what they want to know, and make sure that that's very clear.
Tim, can I ask you a follow-up question? Like Beth, I was curious about how you get in touch with these blueberry farmers. Did they reach out to you? What did that process of making that connection for this applied science look like?
So, I mean, the blueberry farmer in question did reach out to us. And the reason why a lot of farmers are aware of the State Climate Office is that we're kind of entangled with the North Carolina Extension Program, which is a program by the university that interacts with the agricultural community. So through those different connections, different farmers are made aware of us, and that we collect climate data that can be useful for them, you know, historical data. And we also have a couple different agricultural products available on our website to forecast things like chill hours, or, you know, when you can harvest peanuts and stuff, for example, because you need a certain level of moisture. So we have a lot of those tools available to us. And so because of that, a lot of the farmers that are interested in climate related things, they can find us that way through those different interpersonal connections.
Awesome. Anything to add to that? Okay. There's a great question in here from Skylar Hopkins for Jeff. The question is that, or the statement is that there's all these amazing long-term herpetological studies, including and collections, including for threatened and declining species. And the question is, are there any research projects you think we're totally missing that could improve herp, which means reptiles and amphibians, conservation here in North Carolina?
I'm sure there are loads of projects that we're missing. It'd be nice to have 1,000 people to study every species. But on the other hand, you can study something to death and still lose it. What these herps really need is we know what most of them need. We need their habitat protected, and that needs to happen before we go too overboard on research. They've got to have a place to live, and the big threat to reptiles and amphibians and most other species in North Carolina is it's not really climate change. It's just outright, straightforward loss, destruction, and alteration of habitat. They're losing it. And when they lose it, they'll be gone with it. But
Yeah,
maybe I can think of some specific projects. If I do, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I'm sure Skylar would love, and I'd love to be on that email too if you think about some.
She's already working on a big statewide parasite study with snakes. So that's one thing we've missed. Nobody knows anything about the parasites of most of these creatures. They'll go extinct along with their hosts.
Right. Yeah, just so much biodiversity there. Okay, a great question from Sarah Hecox in the chat that's asking what areas of climate research are at odds with each other, or are there any that are at odds with each other? And what can we do to mediate those conflicts as we work towards kind of commonly shared goals to address the climate crisis and address these big problems? The softball questions are over. It's time for hard questions.
I guess I can take a stab at this. I wouldn't necessarily say that there are different components of it that are necessarily at odds with each other. A lot of times in science, the issue is just priorities, like what Beth said. You know, different agencies have different priorities, and so what you care about in terms of the research that you do might not necessarily line up with certain agencies' priorities, and then that also vary, you know, from year to year. So sometimes there's a lot of focus put on the social science part of climate change. So there'll be lots of funding opportunities for people working in, you know, climate communications and things like that. And because there's only so much money to go around, you know, in the years that those type of programs are prioritized, then the natural programs, see a decline, and that goes back and forth. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you're in conflict so much as you're in competition. And how that plays out is entirely dictated by the funding agencies and organizations' priorities.
Yeah, any additions?
I think that's a really good answer. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of one goes up and one comes down, and then you kind of wait for your turn. Yeah, I think that is a great answer, Tim. Okay, a question that I know me and Thomas are really excited to ask you, which is also kind of a little more of a hardball question, is what do we, and Jeff kind of already alluded to this, so maybe it's timely, but the question is, what happens when the science is not showing the answer that people want to hear? And I think even more kind of, if you can think of an example where I know some piece of research or some sort of conclusion from the literature like disrupts everyday lives. I mean, and how do we deal with that? And is there an example from your field of study?
I think this is a very hard question. I used to serve on the North Carolina Science Panel for Coastal Hazards for several years, and at the beginning of my tenure I think it was in 2010, 2012, that panel had been working to develop some sea level rise guidance, more local guidance, because as we've all known that, sometimes general global sea level rise predictions don't really apply exactly to a local area. And there's been a lot of work since 2010 on that, thankfully. But our science panel was working on that. And as part of that, we did get public feedback and such. And there definitely were groups that didn't really want to hear a whole lot about potential sea level rise forecasts for real estate on the coast of North Carolina. I think a lot of that perception and reaction has changed in those ensuing years, but it definitely can be something that you do need to be sensitive to, and making sure, like Dr. Glotfelty said, that you're managing expectations, and you're not, if you're talking about potential sea level rise rates and predictions, that you're not, saying this is 100% going to happen and stuff like that. You're, maybe trying to just kind of inform planning information. So I do think managing expectations and being clear about limitations is very important.
Yeah, any other additions to that? What do you do when it's just the wrong message?
We just have to keep trying to make people see that it's the right message. Most of what we say people don't want to hear, unless it's something that they think is benefiting them directly. They don't want to hear any bad news. They don't want to think that they're responsible for anything that's going wrong. Most scientists aren't good at reaching out to the public and giving talks and trying to make them understand, what science is. And there are people out there that think science is like a religion or a belief system, and instead of a method of gathering information. And we've just got to try to keep reaching out to these people and do all that we can. We need to be more than just focused on our own research. We need to reach out to people, and that's hard for scientists to do, but they've got to get good at it. Got to get better at it than we are now.
Yeah. Okay. I think we will, when we respect everyone's time, we'll wrap it there. I just have a couple of last things to share with you before let me make sure. Is that working? Is that working? Sorry. Let me just make sure that's working.
Yes.
It is. Just a couple of things. First is just to say thank you. First, a huge thank you to our presenters. Thanks for taking this time out of your day. We really appreciate you. And thanks for the attention of the audience. Thanks so much for being here and attending with us. We got upcoming seminars as part of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So there's one at November 4th, also presented and organized by our graduate student colleagues in the Global Change Fellowship. That one's all about environmental justice, so put that on your calendar. And then another great presentation on November 29th from Dr. Yoichiro Kano, which is all about brook trout populations in the southeastern United States. And Kristen has put those in the chat, and you can click on them there. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much, speakers. Really good cross-cutting insights there. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you for the opportunity.